Welcome back to the third and final segment of the Deliverables training module. We're going to start off by talking about communication between the FPS therapist and the referring social worker. The contract provides for us to have weekly case updates with the referring social worker. That's at least once each week, providing feedback regarding every case at least once during a calendar week. In a high-needs case, and that would be determined either by you or by the referring social worker, updates probably need to occur more frequently depending on the intensity of the case. So if the social worker requests a specific protocol, for example, they might say, I want you to call me every time you hear from the client, or I want you to call me at least every other day, let me know what's going on, then it's the expectation that you'll go along with that. So case updates don't just have to be a phone call to the referring social worker. According to the contract, case updates can include phone calls, including voice messages. You all know how busy social workers are, and thank goodness allowing us to leave voice messages does count as a weekly update. Faxed or emailed written updates are acceptable as long as you use encrypted email. Any face-to-face contact with the social worker where you're talking about a specific case, that counts as an update. Any formal or informal staffing regarding the case. The contract actually just mentions formal staffings, but there may be times where, let's say, for example, you go down to your local Children's Administration office for some meeting and you encounter the referring social worker for this case. And you have 15 minutes where you can both talk in a private setting about the case. That's an informal staffing. Maybe someone else is present as well, but that counts as an update. Any type of case update must be documented in the client file, and you also have to list it on the monthly status report. In addition to being required to make that weekly contact, the client service contract also established some special conditions under which you need to get in touch with the referring social worker. In the contract, these are known as notifications. I'm going to briefly address each of those, although I want to give the client service contract some credit because it is very specific and very clear under what the conditions are that you need to notify the social worker and in what way you need to notify them. There are 6 as a matter of fact, specific conditions where you need to get in touch with the social worker. These conditions are the family's unwilling to meet, and that means within those first 48 hours. The safety plan, which means that new safety concerns have been found. A change in residence, missed appointments, unusual incidents, or the death of a client. I'm going to kind of lay out each one of these for you briefly because while, like I said, the contract is fairly specific and self-explanatory, your response is different in nearly every case. So we will also be looking at a cheat sheet in a little bit that clarifies each one of these things. So as I mentioned, you have 48 hours to meet with a client when you get a referral. If the family's unwilling or unable to meet with you, you have to document it and notify the social worker as soon as possible, but certainly within those 48 hours. By the way, I did mention that you are under an obligation to meet with each new client within 48 hours. But if the client is unwilling or unable to meet with you, essentially you're off the hook. As long as you document it and contact the social worker, you would not be held as non-compliant with that contractual requirement. Second condition, safety plan. already mentioned this, if during an FPS intervention you discover safety concerns that weren't addressed in or by a social worker's safety plan, or if there was no safety plan at all, you have to notify the social worker immediately and follow up within written notification within 24 hours. Now, already you can see a difference. If the family can't meet with you within 48 hours, you document it, you let the social worker know within 48 hours. If you note safety concerns, you notify the social worker immediately and you follow up with written notification within 24 hours. And again, if it's a CPS concern, you also notify CPS intake. Change in residence. If any member of a family that's been referred by Children's Administration and they move during the course of an intervention, you need to contact the social worker either verbally or in writing within 1 working day to notify the social worker of that change in residence. Missed appointments. Now, missed appointments are a little bit more involved. There is a fairly elaborate procedure for dealing with any type of missed appointment. And when I say missed appointment, I'm referring to either a client doesn't show or isn't available for a scheduled appointment with you as the FPS therapist, or maybe they've missed some other type of appointment that is related in some way to the reason for referral. For example, let's say a referral was for a malnourished child, and regular visits to the pediatrician is one of the conditions for that family being able to retain the child in the home. If the pediatrician's office calls you and says, Mom failed to bring her child in for that appointment, that counts as a missed appointment. If a probation officer contacts you, or you call them and say, did Tom show up for his meeting with you? And the probation officer says, no, he didn't. You let the social worker know of that missed appointment if meeting with the PO is one of the conditions for probation or for having the children in the home. So basically, when you learn that a client has missed an appointment, so either you learn it because you go there and they're not there, or someone tells you that an appointment has been missed, you must verbally notify the referring social worker within 1 hour of learning of that missed appointment. Then, after you've notified them verbally, you go back to your office, you complete a missed appointment form, which is technically called the IFPS FPS No-Show and Missed Appointment Report, the form with the world's longest title. You need to complete that. It does not have to be typewritten. It can be handwritten. So let's look at the missed appointment form. Okay. The actual form isn't gray. It looks a little bit different than what's showing right now. What you must do is make sure that the missed appointment form contains this information: the date of the appointment missed, the type of appointment missed, there's some little check boxes there, the reason the appointment missed, and of course if it's a no-show, you don't know. All you can put down is no-show. Any follow-up actions taken by you or by the client, and any concerns that you might have about this. So for example, if there's been a pattern of missed appointments, if this is an ongoing thing, or if there's some reason that you were particularly anxious for the client to keep this appointment, then be sure and list that concern. Once you've completed the missed appointment form, you have to either fax or deliver it to the referring social worker within 24 hours of learning of the missed appointment. Typically what I would do, if I showed up at a client's home and they weren't there, I'd wait for a little while, give them a chance to get there. Then typically before I even went back to the office, I'd call the referring social worker on my cell phone, leave a message if they weren't there, advising them of the missed appointment. Then I'd return to my office, write up the missed appointment form, make a brief charting note in the client file, and then fax the missed appointment form to the referring social worker's office. Or, of course, if your office or home, if you work out of your home, is close to Children's Administration, you could just drop that off. But it is critical that the social worker get that missed appointment form within 24 hours of your learning that an appointment was missed. You also need to retain a copy of that form in the client's file. Of course, if you faxed it, then you still have the original to put in the client file. The next item on the list is unusual incidents. The way the contract defines this is essentially an unusual incident would be something that impacts the child's health, safety, or well-being, their living situation, their permanent plan, or something along those lines. Then you have to contact the social worker immediately. You also need to follow up with verbal notification in writing within 24 hours. I mean, follow up the verbal notification with written notification within 24 hours. The contract does give us some examples of what might be considered an unusual incident. These could be things like an unexpected change in a child or an adult's medical or psychological condition, an adverse reaction to a medication. This might be more critical, say, if you were working with a child in foster care. Severe behavioral incident unlike the child's ordinary behavior, a severe injury, running away, physical self-abuse or abuse of others, or sexual assaults or sexual behaviors that are age inappropriate. These types of things would all be examples of unusual incidents, but by no means is this an exclusive list. There would be lots of other possibilities that would be things that significantly impact the family's functioning overall, things that you feel the social worker needs to be aware of. Death of a client. You know, you would think that this is so obvious as to not need to be listed, but certainly if you learn of the death of a member of the immediate family with whom you're working, you need to contact the social worker immediately. Typically, that's referring to anyone who was on the referral, anyone who's living in the home as immediate family members. That immediate verbal notification needs to be followed up in writing within 24 hours of your learning of the family member's death. So I do want to point out the contract is really clear, specific, and direct about these notifications, but as you noticed, everything is slightly different. Some you notify immediately, some you have 24 hours, some 1 working day. So in order to make this really clear to you, we've provided you with another cheat sheet to keep these things straight. I highly recommend that you keep a copy of this cheat sheet near your phone or computer or where you're likely to be when you become aware or when you decide to contact the social worker. So let's look at the communication sheet. And because we've covered all of these items, we don't need to go down the list or anything. Again, it's very important that you keep these things straight. If you or your agency are audited by a contract monitor, your compliance with these requirements is one of the things that they'll be looking for. So be sure that you follow these to the letter. You know, we've covered most of the kinds of situations that and expectations during an intervention. So let's talk now about termination of services. One of the really nice things that has been in the contract for probably 6 or 7 years now used to be it was pretty much 100% up to the family preservation therapist as to when services would terminate. And the contract spelled out 2 or 3 conditions, like you haven't had contact with the client for 5 days or something like that. That essentially evolved out of intensive family preservation services, but it doesn't really apply to FPS. Now, deciding when to terminate a case is a mutual decision between the FPS therapist and the referring social worker, and of course the client has a significant amount of impact or input into that as well. But the contract does provide a list of guidelines for determining under what types of conditions a case should be closed. So let's turn to the termination handout. It's a table that explains specific conditions under which cases should be closed. So let's talk about the very best reason for terminating a case. Obviously, the best reason to close an FPS case is because all the goals have been accomplished. The goals have been reached, the children are safe, there's not really any more work to do. Best possible reason doesn't always happen, unfortunately, but you as the therapist can say, I feel confident that these children are going to remain safe. The second item listed on the table here is actually the reason that cases are more frequently closed, and that is because the service authorization has expired. What this refers to is that either the 6 months have come and gone, and it's time to close the case, or that the funds have all been expended. I mentioned earlier that FPS cases typically don't stay open for the entire 6 months, and that certainly is unfortunately true. The average length of time is right around 4 months that cases are still open. Anytime you become aware that the 6 months are almost up or that the funds are almost gone, you need to immediately start working with the client around termination so that it doesn't happen abruptly. You no longer have the authorization to continue working with a family once that the money is gone or the time is up. The third item on the list is a lack of client participation. Now, anytime you're working with a family and you notice you seem to be doing all the work, the client has worked with you on developing a service plan, but things that they say they're going to do, they haven't been doing. Or there's a lot of frequent cancellations or rescheduling of appointments. Things just don't seem to be happening. That's not a good way to spend the state's money. You're spinning your wheels, no progress is happening. Talking it over with the social worker is what needs to happen at this point, and if the two of you agree, then you can go ahead and close the case. You know, one thing to keep in mind, though, is sometimes a social worker will try to encourage you to keep a case open even if you haven't seen the client for a certain amount of time. This is not the best idea. It's important to remember that you and your agency have a certain amount of liability in what happens while a case is open. So if you're not actively involved with a client, don't keep the case open indefinitely, even if the social worker is really pushing for that. Remember that liability concern. The next item kind of fits along with that, and that is a loss of client contact. If for some reason you have a missed appointment and then there's a long period of silence, the phone maybe is disconnected, or you go over to keep an appointment and you notice the screen door is flapping back and forth in the breeze, and when you look in the window there's no furniture in the home. If you have lost contact with a client, again, as I mentioned, the social worker may ask you to make an effort to try to locate the client, and you may have some ideas about where you might be able to find them or catch up with them. But if you have lost contact, you're going to need to close that case, unfortunately. Again, it may be a possibility for it to be re-referred if the client connects with you. But you don't want to hold a case open indefinitely. The next item is if the family withdraws their voluntary consent. And again, that is kind of, it goes without saying. The services are voluntary. If the family says to you, we don't want to do this anymore, you cannot force yourself on them. So that is in essence the same as taking that voluntary service agreement and ripping it in two. Let the social worker know that immediately, because you no longer have authorization to foist yourself on that family. Again, the client or the referring social worker may want to try and convince you to, be persuasive to work with the client, but there are limits to that. Sometimes also there are clinical considerations to think about. For example, if you're working with someone who's diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, they may fire you on a weekly basis. In that case, you may want to actually hold off terminating services immediately and wait until they call you up and say, "I'm sorry, I really want you back." But for all intents and purposes, when a family says, "We're not going to do this anymore," that means it's time to close the case. Now, I mentioned earlier in reunification cases, you only have 30 days in which that child needs to be returned home, or you have to close the case. There's also sort of the flip side of that. If a child is in the home but then has to be removed and is out of the home for at least 14 days, then you also have to close the case. Now, let me specify just a little bit. That is, if there's only one child identified as being in need of services, or if all the children in the home leave or are placed elsewhere. You have to have at least one identified child and one primary caregiver present in order to have an FPS case. So if the child comes back within 14 days, then you can keep the case open. If 14 days come and go and the child remains out of the home, then the case must be closed. Okay? The last thing I want to point out is if there are safety concerns that you and the family can't agree on a viable safety plan, then it's reasonable to close the case. And that may mean that there are circumstances that the family is aware of, but they just don't want to change them, they're not willing to change them, or they're unable to change them for some reason or other. It could be, I'm actually thinking of a case that was referred to me once when the referring social worker told me that no one in children's administration would go out to the home because the father had a habit of meeting him at the end of their long gravel driveway with a shotgun. And as it turned out, this father was diagnosed with a chronic mental illness, which is one of my areas of specialization. And so I sort of took that as a challenge to go meet with this family, and it worked out quite well. But had I gone out there and felt intimidated or threatened, felt that my own safety was jeopardized, it would have been entirely reasonable for me to say, I need to close the case because we can't come up with a viable safety plan, i.e. Dad putting away the shotgun, which he later assured me was only an air gun. But nevertheless, when someone's waving something that looks like a shotgun, most people aren't going to ask many questions. So anyway, those are the conditions specified by the contract in terms of when it is reasonable, acceptable, and expected to close a case. Let's talk about documentation. You know, you may find this hard to believe, especially after reading through the contract, but the required documentation in family preservation services is actually fairly small compared to what's required in a lot of other services. But from start to finish, paperwork is one of the most important activities that you'll engage in FPS. So we're going to look at the range of paperwork that's required. The first thing is a client service log. Different agencies refer to this by different names: charting notes, case notes, hours tracking, hours tracking, service log, different things. The bottom line is that what it needs to contain is a listing of all the dates and hours of every case-related activity. There's no example in your packet of handouts because each agency uses a different format, and that's 100% acceptable. What you need to make sure to do is keep track of every hour, well, in 15-minute increments, that you spend involved in any case-related activity, whether it's billable or not. So check with your agency as to what format is used. The next piece of paperwork is case notes, charting notes. Again, different agencies refer to these as different things, and every agency uses a different format. But just like you keep track of the hours, in the case or charting notes, you're documenting what the activity was, and a copy of each case note needs to be included in the client file. Case notes need to include the name of the staff providing the service, the date of the service or activity, the location of the service or activity, concise notes regarding that activity. And when I say concise, I mean you don't have to elaborate, summarize it, and be as concise as you can. You do not need to do a process recording where you're saying, I said, and then he said, and we did this. Summarize the high points. And then you should sign it. Each case note really should be signed. As I mentioned earlier, any activities done by the Parapro, they need to do their own charting notes. The family assessment, and we're just going to talk about contractual requirements for paperwork here. It needs to address all of the pertinent domains in the NCFAS, and it needs to include the NCFAS scores in that written family assessment. As I mentioned earlier, it has to be received within 20 calendar days of the first face-to-face client meeting. The service plan. It needs to list the specific goals of service and the objectives or action steps that will lead to goal achievement. It has to be consistent with and supportive of the case plan developed by the social worker. It needs to be signed by the therapist and by family members and approved by the social worker. Getting the social worker's signature is always a good idea. And it needs to be received by the social worker, like the family assessment, within 20 calendar days of the first face-to-face meeting. Next, we're going to talk about the monthly status report. We will talk about this in detail in the billing and payment module, but for now I want to make sure that you understand that each month the monthly status report needs to be completed and submitted to the fiduciary specialist within 10 working days of the completed month of service. Basically what that means is 10 working days from the first of each month. And it needs to be submitted on the appropriate form designated by Children's Administration. You can't replace that and use any other form. It can't be altered except in one tiny way, which we'll talk about when we look at the monthly status report later on. Also, the completed monthly status report includes, the monthly status report is made up of two separate sections, a narrative section and the financial reconciliation page. And in order for the monthly status report to be considered complete, you have to have both the narrative section and the financial reconciliation page. The narrative portion of the monthly status report needs to include a summary of progress on each service plan goal. Also, if you are requesting reimbursement for concrete goods or support services funds, you also need to attach original receipts for each expenditure. And you need to document how the expenditure was related to the goals of service in the narrative section of the monthly status report. Again, we'll go over that in detail in the billing training module. So let's talk about the exit summary. The exit summary is the most comprehensive document that you'll complete in Family Preservation Services. It's also the one spoken of with the most dread by people who have been doing FPS for a while. It needs to be completed and received by the referring social worker within 10 working days of terminating services with the family. Also, like the monthly status report, it must be submitted on the designated form. It can't be altered. It can't be replaced with any type of substitution. The referring social worker must receive the exact form that you get from Children's Administration. Now, the last form I'm going to talk about in terms of something that you need to take care of as a therapist is the Consumer Satisfaction Survey. And really, all you will do is provide this to the client. It's a Children's Administration designated form that you provide to the client, typically on your last meeting, and you give them, along with that, a pre-addressed postage-paid envelope that goes to Children's Administration in Olympia. However, you need to document in your client file, in the case notes, that you did give the survey to the client. Another document that needs to be done, but may not necessarily be done by you as a therapist, is the quarterly report. Each agency will submit one quarterly report to the FPS program manager in Olympia at the conclusion of each quarter. So if your agency has 5 therapists, a designated person within your agency completes the quarterly report with data from all of you and then turns that in. It needs to be submitted within 30 days of the close of each quarter being January through March, April through June, and so on. There's a database that Children's Administration provides, and the form needs to be completed using that database. There's a lot of information that goes on the quarterly report, and I've listed it here, but there's no need for us to go into that because it's fairly self-explanatory. It also does have directions that go along with it, helping the person in your agency know how to complete the form. This is a big part of the data that gets submitted to the legislature, so it's really important that this be completed and submitted in a timely fashion. So, although that may seem like a lot, it really isn't a lot of documentation. There are not a huge number of deadlines, but to help you keep track of them, we've completed another little cheat sheet for you that's referred to as the Documentation and Deadline Summary. It shows what documentation is required and when it's due. This is another one of those items that I would suggest you just keep handy somewhere. Post it on your bulletin board next to your computer, something like that. If you're very high-tech, you can enter these into your computer. I've been told there's all sorts of nice things that you can do, but I'm fairly old school, and I tend to rely on my wall or desk calendar. Okay, so we've talked about the different types of documentation, the types of deadlines, when they are, what's expected of you. if your agency, I should say when your agency is audited and a contract monitor comes to call, they will be looking through personnel records, administrative records, as well as client files to make sure that you're keeping track of everything that you need to keep on hand. So let's look at what the expectations are. The contract says contracting agencies must maintain files on each client. Typically, the designated therapist keeps their own files. So if you work outside of an office, if you work from your own home, you're going to need to make sure that you have some sort of secure location where you can keep client files, unless your agency expects you to keep the file in a central location. But you're going to be adding to the client file constantly. So typically maintaining your own client files is going to be the most logical way of doing it. Client files need to be presented to Children's Administration on demand at any time they choose. So don't expect to get advance warning, although you typically will. They will say, an auditor is coming out to your office and they'll be there on such and such date, and we'll be auditing these contracts. So that would generally be the way it happens. But keep in mind, especially if there's any reason for a social worker or anyone else within Children's Administration to be concerned about their record keeping, they absolutely have the right to say, I need to see the Smith file, and your obligation is to provide that at that particular moment. What this means is you need to keep current with everything, particularly those day-to-day things like case notes and hours tracking. So don't trust that you'll be able to remember things and put them off until tomorrow. Or one of the things that I've sometimes found when I've done quality assurance monitoring is that the case notes haven't been in the client file. And when I questioned the therapist, what they've said is, oh, I have them all on a disk. All I have to do is print them off. They need to be in the client's file as soon as possible. The contract does contain a very lengthy list of what needs to be included in the client file. And I want to point out, you can keep additional documents in the client file. There is nothing that says if a client gives you their child's school picture or a poem that they wrote or a copy of their divorce decree or something like that, you may keep those things in the client file. What the contract specifies is those types of documentation that absolutely must be in the client file. Let's look at the client file list. It's spelled out quite nicely in the contract, but just to make it easily accessible to you, we've given you this list that does come straight from the contract. Make sure that whatever the format your agency uses, you can have them organized any way you want to organize them. But here's something to keep in mind. An auditor who can find what they're looking for is a happy auditor. So having a table of contents, having things organized in a consistent, logical way is certainly going to be to your advantage for a lot of different reasons. The list here are the things that absolutely must be in the client's file without exception. Any questions about that? Okay. I want to look a little bit, we've been focusing so far on Exhibit A, the Statement of Work. Now we're going to look just briefly at Exhibit B and some of the specific program requirements. One of the most important things in Exhibit B, of course, is the issue of therapist credentials and experience. In family preservation, all professional staff must have, at the very least, a bachelor's degree in a social or behavioral science or a closely related field, and at least 2 years of direct casework experience working with families and children. Now, on top of that, at least 50% of the professional staff in a given agency must have not only that minimum requirement, but they must have at least a master's degree plus 1 year of direct casework experience working with families and children. Now, that master's degree may be substituted, or you may substitute for the master's degree a bachelor's degree plus 3 years of experience. But remember, there's that extra year of experience, it says. So that is equivalent to a bachelor's degree plus 4 years. So you can have a master's with 1 year or a bachelor's with 4 years. 50% of your professional staff have to meet that higher level of credentialing. All professional staff need to be registered as a counselor or licensed in at least one of these fields: social worker, mental health professional, or marriage and family therapist. Occasionally, exceptions to this policy can be granted. Typically, you will need to contact the FPS program manager in Olympia. Exceptions are fairly rare, though. In the contract, there's a lengthy list of degree requirements, so I want to just encourage you to refer to the current FPS contract for that listing of specific requirements. Another thing specified in the contract is that where licenses are required, they must all be in good standing. And if any required license is suspended, or if there's been any limitations or restrictions placed on a license, then you or the contractor, your agency, must notify the regional contract manager. Now, there's a lot of training, specific training that is required by the contract. The contract says each contractor is required to ensure that all FPS therapists obtain this list of trainings within 60 days of being hired to provide FPS services. And what they list are a designated number of hours of specialized FPS training. This training that you're going through now is part of that. And it needs to be completed before the staff or subcontractor begins work with families referred by Children's Administration. Also, the NCFAS training that I mentioned earlier. A designated number of hours of approved training must be completed by each FPS therapist. These required number of hours do change periodically, so I haven't specified these. You'll need to refer to the current FPS contract for the specific number of hours. The NCFAS training can either be in person or it can be using the approved training materials, which include videos and so on, under the supervision of an FPS therapist who has already completed the in-person training. And I might point out that wherever it's possible to actually participate in an in-person training, you have more of an opportunity to ask questions and so on. Also to just benefit from the interaction with others taking the training at the same time. So when you do have an option of taking an in-person training or using training materials, I would recommend doing the in-person training if it's possible. Motivational interviewing. I mentioned that there was a required training for that. A designated number of hours of training by CA-approved trainers needs to be completed by each FPS provider. You'll love the MI training. It's wonderful. Other trainings that are required are orientation on quality assurance standards. These would be things that would typically be provided by administrators or clinicians in your agency. Also, specialized training in the provision of family support services and development of community support training, support services. These may also be provided by your agency, or they may be trainings that you can access through your community, through local universities, extension services, and so on. I want to make sure that everybody understands that any professional staff or subcontractor who's assigned to work with a family before they receive these trainings, it's not completely non-allowed, but you have to be supervised by an FPS therapist who has completed the training. So if your agency tells you, here's a family, you need to start working with them, and you haven't completed the training yet, you must be closely supervised by an FPS therapist, not an administrator, a therapist who has gone through all of the required FPS training. Now let's talk about requirements for paraprofessional staff or paraprofessional subcontractors. Sometimes when I'm doing an in-person training, I ask, what are the credentials required to be a paraprofessional in FPS? And everybody scratches their head and starts flipping through the contract. And the truth is, it's kind of a trick question, because the contract does not specify credentials or years of experience for paraprofessionals. And periodically the idea of doing that is tossed around, but there's a good reason not to have those limits. And that is so that your agency can hire or contract with paraprofessionals who meet your current needs. And they may not need a bachelor's degree in social services. Maybe what they need to do is speak a specific language or have experience dealing with prematurely born infants or something like that. Some area of expertise that they don't necessarily have to be an MSW or have the same types of credentials. So the contract does not specify requirements as such for parapros. Each contractor, though, each provider, is required to develop a list of training standards and other requirements for parapros, and those are going to depend on your individual agency. These expectations are submitted to Children's as part of the contractor's operating procedures. One more thing. All staff and subcontractors involved in providing FPS also are required to have completed mandated reporter training and to receive certification in CPR and first aid. There's a fairly lengthy list of requirements of what goes in administrative files, personnel files, and they're all contained in Exhibit B. So please be sure to be very familiar with them. If you are an agency administrator or if you work alone as a licensed as a contracted provider, it's really important that you know these things inside and out. We're nearing the end. In conclusion, you know, as an FPS provider, you really, really need to have an absolutely clear and thorough understanding of what you've agreed to deliver in accepting an FPS contract to yourself, to your clients, to Children's Administration. Complying with all of these expectations is going to increase your effectiveness as a clinician, and it's also going to enable you to better serve the families that you're working with. So keeping all of these things in mind, you and the families you work with are happily going to walk off into the sunset. Thank you for taking part in this training. As I mentioned previously, if you do have questions, make sure to take them to your supervisor, to a designated trainer, to the FPS program manager in Olympia, or to your regional program consultant. Thank you.